Welcome back, everyone, as we dive into part 2 of Kings and Generals series on the English Civil War. Now, a number of you have pointed out that in more modern times, a lot of folks are starting to refer to this time period not as the English Civil War, but as the War of the Three Kingdoms, meaning Scotland, Ireland, and England, because there is more fighting that happens during this time that is connected to all of this, that is not about the battle between royalists and parliamentarians. There's also a fight going on for Ireland, and I'm sure that's going to be talked about. And so it's an interesting kind of, I don't want to call it revisionist history, because it's really just a redefining of what happened. And I think it's probably a fairer assessment, though there certainly is an English Civil War going on in the midst of all this. So if you did not see the first episode of my reaction to this, the link's in the description. The link is also there to the original content. Thanks, Kings and Generals, for stopping by and saying hi and showing your support on the video from episode 1. I also want to say thank you to somebody who wrote, I'm sorry, I don't remember if I saw your name in the profile or not, but who actually wrote the first episode, who stopped by as well. So that was really cool. Fantastic work. Excited to learn more. Let's go ahead and dive into part 2.
In our last episode on the English Civil War, we discussed the many factors which gradually ramped up the tension between King Charles I of England and his parliament between the late 1620s and early 1630s. Discontent towards the monarch was growing among certain parties, but civil war still seemed absolutely unthinkable to the vast majority of English, who by 1637 had enjoyed nearly a half-century of peace.
And yesterday I mentioned that this was not the first time there had been what you could call a civil war in England. And it's important to note, there I used that word again, I used it a lot in the first episode. Several of you pointed out correctly that at the time of what we call today the Wars of the Roses, so there's a lot of terms like that we use now that weren't used at the time. Talking about the Plantagenet dynasty, that's not something that was used at the time. They never called themselves the Plantagenets. They were referred to as the Angevin dynasty at the time because they came from the Count of Anjou in France. So at the time, or I shouldn't say directly at the time, but in the aftermath, when you have Shakespeare writing about the events of the 15th century, they were commonly called the Civil Wars. So they were referred to as Civil Wars. A lot of times this happens until something comes along that replaces it in our memory. You know, in the United States in the 19th century, there was a Great Depression. We don't call it that anymore because when we talk about the Great Depression, we're talking about what happened in the 1930s. But before that, there was another depression that was called the Great Depression. So things change.
However, war was indeed on the horizon, and in this episode, we will explore the events which will escalate the situation beyond all hope of peace, starting with the Scottish Bishops' Wars, the Long Parliament, and the Battle of Edgehill. Your continued support allows us to expand our work, and we're so grateful for that. We're always eager to create more videos for you, and we think that you'll enjoy our documentaries on post-World War II history over on the Cold War channel, and our Wizards and Warriors channel, which focuses on the fantasy and sci-fi lore battle documentaries.
I knew that one was.
We've also recently started a TikTok channel, and would appreciate your support on that new platform. Consider subscribing to all three. The links are in the description and pinned comment. Thanks for being with us. Throughout the latter part of his personal rule, opposition began to mount increasingly against King Charles I. However, this opposition could not be channeled into any meaningful change due to the irregular and infrequent intervals in which Parliament convened. Nevertheless, this state of affairs would soon change due to growing unrest to the north in Scotland, where the meddling of one Archbishop Laud was about to trigger a war. Scotland's decentralised and radically Protestant church, known as the Presbyterian Church, had deeply ingrained roots in the country's lowlands. And
there's a lot going on in Scotland that we really don't talk about so much because Scotland at this point now kind of becomes linked with England, right? But man, there's some serious religious upheaval going on there too. A lot of people died You go to Edinburgh, for example, and you see memorials there to the Covenanters. You go to the Greyfriars Cemetery, which is amazing, by the way, and I highly recommend it. I did make a full video from there that I haven't uploaded yet, like a lot of other things. But there's a whole section of that cemetery that was kind of locked off and was a place for these Covenanters to meet. And there's a memorial there to the Covenanters. And, so while religious upheaval's happening in other countries, it's certainly happening in Scotland too.
Parts of the Highlands. The Scots held on to their native faith lovingly, so when Charles and his administration tried to impose the Anglican Book of Common Prayer on them by royal decree, England's northern neighbour began to implode. Nationalist sentiment was stoked among all the classes, all the way from leading Scottish nobles down to the servant girls, one of whom notoriously threw a stool at the minister in St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh when he attempted to read from the Anglican book.
It's fascinating to me that at this point, one of the sources of upheaval against the royalists is coming from Scotland against a very Scottish king. And then later, it's going to be Scotland where you're going to see the charge led to restore the Stuarts when they lose the throne to the Hanover dynasty.
An organised response came on February 29, 1638, when Scottish lords signed the National Covenant, a pledge to uphold the native Scottish religion at all costs. This covenant pledged loyalty to the king, but on the condition that the Presbyterian Church was maintained in its unmolested form. This covenant circled around Scotland and gained rapturous support on all fronts.
Covenanters. And actually you'll see in places like Northeast Ohio, where I live, my Chambers family, they were originally Scots who ended up going over to Ulster as part of the plantations there, and then eventually came to America, and they became part of what in America we call Scots-Irish ancestors, because they were Scottish, but they had settled in Ireland, and then they come from Ireland to the United States. And a lot of my Chambers ancestors who were Scots-Irish are buried in what's called the Covenanter Cemetery,
with its adherents becoming known as Covenanters. Over the next year, attempts at a negotiated solution failed, and war became inevitable. As a result, both sides began to raise their armies, the highly motivated Scots more quickly than the English, many of whom were actually sympathetic to the Scottish cause. Critically, this war footing began to push Charles's finances to the breaking point.
He needs Parliament to raise more money, and what got him into this problem in the first place? Trying to go around Parliament to make the money. And now what's he going to do? He's going to go to Parliament for the money, which he could have done in the first place and avoided this whole mess.
Compound matters, many of his aristocratic financiers were Catholic. The First Bishops' War of 1639 was short and inconclusive, ending with the pacification of Berwick, which both sides realized would not put an end to the conflict.
Correct me if I'm wrong, friends who live in the UK. I always thought it was pronounced Berwick. Am I wrong? Berwick is how it looks, but like a lot of other things, like it's not Edinburgh, it's Edinburgh. And, it's not Leicester, it's Leicester. I just always thought it was Berwick for some reason.
So, both the Scots and the English began preparing for its resumption. However, Charles's war chest had run dry, and with all his sources of finance dried up, he was forced on April 13th to summon what would become known as the Short Parliament,
Goes to Parliament,
the first in 11 years. However, after just 3 weeks of subsequent stalemate and frustration on both sides, the king dissolved Parliament again on May 5th, 1639.
It makes me wonder if it wouldn't have been better for him to have just never called it in the first place, but to call them, have it end in a frustrating way, and then dissolve them again, I feel like it just made things worse.
Charles then immediately resumed collection of the hated ship money in order to fund his war. The Second Bishops' War of 1640 was a complete disaster for the king. A Scottish army of 20,000 Covenanters, led by the highly competent Earl of Leven, managed to outmaneuver the English, and not long after defeated them at the Battle of Newburn. Following what was the first Scottish victory on English soil since 1388, Leven occupied northeastern England.
If you're an American who, particularly if you have roots in like the Carolinas, Tennessee, Eastern Kentucky, a lot of Scots ended up there, and a lot of them came during all of this because they were like getting out of Dodge, or when their side lost, they came over. And so if you are in your roots, tracing your family history, and you find that you have Scottish ancestry, and a lot, like I said, a lot of that area is where the Scots settled, and you find that they came over in the 17th century, this might be why.
Note, the Earl of Leven, also known as Alexander Leslie, had spent the previous decade fighting in the 30 Years' War in the service of Sweden's Gustavus Adolphus. We've previously covered his contribution to the Siege of Stralsund. To end this disastrous conflict, Charles signed the Treaty of Ripon, the terms of which required that the king pay the Scots £850 per day to maintain their occupation. Now burdened by this new financial drain, in addition to his own army, Charles was once again forced to call a parliament. Holding its first session on November 3rd, 1640, this would become known as the Long Parliament.
So you can see that he's backing himself into a corner, and a lot of it is of his own making. It's a lot of bad choices on top of bad choices, and he's kind of forced himself in this position where he's going to get increasingly desperate. And then he's going to have to make some choices he probably might not have otherwise made. I'm not blaming him. I'm also not giving him a pass. Everybody's to blame in all of this.
Because it would not be formally dissolved until March 1660. This time, Parliament was almost totally united against the king, and its more radical Puritan elements, led by the Earl of Warwick, began to dominate affairs. His radical allies tried and executed the Earl of Strafford, Charles's chief minister, began lengthy legal proceedings against Archbishop Laud.
So why do they do that so often? There's so many times in English history and in British history where you see chief advisors, chief ministers to the king brought down, and in a lot of cases executed or killed by a mob, because people, for the most part, it's going to change here obviously, they're not going to go after the king. To go after the king is treason. So what you do is say, I'm loyal to the king. It's his terrible advisors that are leading him astray, and we need to deal with them. If we deal with them, we know the king will do the right thing. He's just listening to the wrong people. So that's the way you commit treason without committing treason. That's the way you fight back against the leadership of the country without crossing that line.
And secured other unprecedented concessions from the crown. All of these demands and more were set out in the Grand Remonstrance, a document of grievances and conditions, the most crucial of which would have deprived the king of many traditionally royal rights and privileges. It didn't seem that Charles was going to accept any further restriction of his power anyway, but an external factor now intervened and made everything that much worse. In October, the month before the king had summoned the Long Parliament, a Catholic revolt had erupted in Ireland.
There you go.
Thousands of Protestants...
So now, remember the context that I gave at the beginning, the War of Three Kingdoms, right? Ireland is a big part of all of this.
...were already dead, and many more were refugees. It was clear that an army would be necessary to quell the Irish. But under
Charles can't even deal with it he's already got to deal with. He's already having trouble financially without these wars. Now he's not only got to deal with an invasion from Scotland, now he's got problems happening in Ireland too. Where's he going to get the money and the troops to do all of this?
Whose authority could the army be raised? Parliament no longer trusted the king with military force, fearing that he would use the army against them, while the king would not accept Parliament's control because of the same reason. For some reason, perhaps because Charles had uncovered evidence that his enemies in Parliament had been conspiring with the Covenanters, Charles marched to the House of Commons with 400 soldiers on January 5, 1642. There, he attempted to arrest 5 MPs.
This is a major line being crossed right here. Now it's not just the king going in and dissolving parliament. He's going in with the military. This is like his crossing the Rubicon moment for a lot of people.
Pym, John Hampden, Arthur Hazelrig, Denzil Halls, and William
Hazelrig. So I'm still trying to work it out. Here comes your drinking game. I'm related to him somehow. Arthur Hazelrig. I believe he comes from Leicester, and I have Hazelrigs in my paternal line that come from Leicester, and I'm trying to figure it out. I think there's a connection there, and my Hazelrigs came to America in the 1660s, right around the time that all of this went down.
Ostensible ringleaders of this imagined Covenanter conspiracy. When this attempt embarrassingly failed, the royal family quickly left London and went to Windsor Castle, fearing that the Parliament-supporting London mobs would be riled into a fury against them.
So Windsor Castle is, I don't know how many miles it is, but it's right by Heathrow Airport. It's west of the city of London. It takes about a half hour to get into London by train from Windsor. Half hour, 40 minutes, something like that. But it's right along the Thames River. So it's easily accessible by boat, but it's far enough outside the city, and it's well fortified. It's a much easier place to defend yourself if you're the king than being in London.
From this point forward, King Charles and his opponents at Westminster edged slowly closer to civil war, with each side unwilling to blink, and both sides hoping that the other would do so first. Charles was able to convince many of his English and Welsh subjects that he stood for the defence of their traditional constitution and Elizabethan church doctrine, while Parliament argued that the king ought to be deprived of his remaining constitutional powers, as it was clear that he could not be trusted to use them. This too attracted many supporters, as did the widespread Puritan desire in Parliament to undertake radical religious reform.
So I feel like I should point out here, and I'm going to acknowledge that I don't fully understand it myself, and maybe some of our friends in the UK can explain it better than I can. Here in the United States, when we talk about the Constitution, we're talking about a very specific written document, the Constitution, that was ratified in 1787 and now includes over 24 amendments. In England, when they're referring to the Constitution, it is not a specific written document like we have in the United States. It's really more a set of traditions and customs and laws that have become a part of who they are. It's not one specific document. It's kind of their basis for government altogether.
In the end, both sides attracted enough support to take the final step towards civil war. By early 1642, Charles had moved his court north to the city of York. Attempting to seize control of the situation in Ireland and assume military authority of their own, Parliament unconstitutionally issued the Militia Ordinance in March 1642, permitting them to raise an army and appoint its commanders.
I love how both sides now are just going to basically say, whatever, we're just ignoring the law. Now it's really just about power and who's in charge. And they say absolute power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. You're going to see that now that Parliament has been whining and complaining about abuses of power by the king, and what are they going to do when they get power? They're going to start abusing it.
They chose the staunch anti-royalist Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, whose father had been executed after an attempted coup against Elizabeth I. Now requiring an army of his own to counter that of his enemies at Westminster, Charles passed the equally unconstitutional Commission of Array, allowing the king's chosen commissioners, usually local nobles, to levy troops from their own regions for service in the royal army. As the twin armies slowly began to grow, Charles marched from his base at York to the armoury city of Hull, arriving outside its gates on April 29th. The city contained a vast amount of arms and ammunition, enough to supply the royalist army's coming campaign if it became necessary. As it turned out, Charles was out of luck. Hull's governor, Sir John Hotham, had flipped to the parliamentary cause and barred the gates to the king, forcing His Majesty to retreat in humiliation, eventually ending up in Nottingham.
Now, a lot of times when this sort of thing happens, you better hope you're on the winning side, because if the king ends up winning, he's going to remember who barred their gates against him and come back after you. Now, sometimes the king would show a lot of forgiveness and grace in those situations. You had this happen in the Wars of the Roses, where a few times when these battles happened, there was a lot of forgiveness to go around, but then eventually, if it happened again, a lot of people lost their head.
It was there that on August 22nd, 1642, the king officially raised his royal standard on Castle Hill. In what was thought by many to be an ill omen for the coming clash.
Wait, I have to go get it. Hold on. Now, it looks a little different today because they don't have the fleur-de-lis representing France, because at that time the King of England also claimed to be King of France. But we do have Ireland on there, and you have Scotland, although that part also looks different because now Scotland gets its own corner of things right there. And then England gets with the three lions, they get two sides. Now, if you're in Scotland, the royal standard has two of the Scottish and one of the English. Sorry, Wales.
A storm blew the banner down the following night. The campaign began slowly. On September 9th, Parliament's appointed commander, Essex, established a headquarters at Northampton, with the aim of intercepting Charles's army with his own, and preventing any royalist march on London. The king, meanwhile, was still in a bit of a shaky situation.
So this is all going down in the West Midlands. That's my people's place.
5 regiments of foot and 500 cavalry troopers by this time, the king's army needed more men. In order to get them, Charles departed from Nottingham September 13th, and marched west through Derby, Uttoxeter, Stafford, and Wellington.
And again, I think, I thought this guy was British that was talking, but that's Derby. I think it's pronounced Derby.
Reaching Shrewsbury on the 20th. This position allowed the Royalists to absorb more units Charles's commissioners had raised in North Wales and Lancashire, swelling his army to a workable size. While this was happening, the Royalist horse, under the experienced command of Prince Rupert, took up position in Bridgnorth, aiming to screen any potential parliamentary attack on the main army. Prince Rupert was the son of Frederick V, Elector of the Palatinate, who had failed to gain the throne of Bohemia in 1618, essentially beginning the 30 Years' War.
Oops.
After being captured by the Holy Roman Empire in a military campaign, Rupert had been freed by the diplomatic maneuvering of his uncle, Charles I. He subsequently came over to England and gratefully joined the English king's army as an extremely competent cavalry commander. Essex subsequently attempted to prevent a royalist thrust towards London and deter further royalist reinforcements by marching towards Worcester. While the bulk of Parliament's field army was ponderously making its way through the scattered villages of the Midlands, Essex sent 2 cavalry regiments ahead to secure the west bank of the River Severn. However, when around 1,000 parliamentary horsemen ran into a similar number of Prince Rupert's royalist horsemen at Powick Bridge, the former were quickly routed and driven off by Robert's superior tactics. This was the first true engagement of the Civil War, and was, according to parliamentarian Hugh Peters, where England's sorrows began. Buoyed by this initial victory, the now enlarged royalist army began to move out of Shrewsbury on October 12th, with London as its ultimate objective. Charles would march on the Viper's Nest and end the war here and now. A week later, Essex began his eastward march in pursuit, eventually arriving in the vicinity of Kyneton with the aim of protecting Banbury, while Charles and his army were conducting operations from the nearby town of Edgehill. Because of the two sides' inexperience in war, insufficient scouting had not alerted either side to the presence of the other so close by.
Yeah, when's the last time England's really been in any kind of significant wars at this point? It's been a little while. I mean, there's been some fighting here and there, but nothing major. So yeah, there's a feeling out process happening here. It's kind of like, the first battles in a lot of cases. Look at the Americans' first combat in World War II in North Africa. It goes badly. and they're kind of seen as amateurs until Patton comes in and shapes them up a little bit. American Civil War, First Battle of Bull Run, is just a mess because both sides are very, very green.
A Royalist Council of War at Edgehill, held on the 22nd, decided that a 4,000-strong brigade would attempt to seize Banbury the next day. By nightfall, the King's army was dispersing into billets around the Wormington Hills, while at the same time, Essex's army finally arrived at Kyneton. While Charles was staying at the home of Sir William Chansey, Prince Rupert rode to Wormleighton, and seemingly by chance, managed to capture a quartermaster's party from Essex's army, which was nearby. After prying information from the prisoners, Rupert sent a few mounted scouts to Kyneton, who returned at midnight and confirmed that the entire Parliamentary army was right there. By 3 a.m. on the 23rd...
This is huge because now they've got the advantage. They know where the enemy is. They know what he's doing. They know where to meet him. They can kind of set the terms of the engagement a little bit now.
October, Charles was aware that Essex was in the area, and an hour later, exhausted officers began to dispatch orders to their men for a general rendezvous near the Edgehill Heights. At this point, the King's Royalist army was between Essex and London, meaning that it could have marched towards London relatively unopposed. Yeah. However, Charles and his advisors would not back away from the clash, and decided to do a 180, finally meeting the Roundhead army near Edgehill, 3 miles southeast of Kyneton. By the afternoon of October 23rd, the armies of Parliament and King now faced each other across a section of arable land and meadow just northwest of the main slopes. To all those present on both sides, it seemed as though the decisive battle of the war was at hand.
So it's interesting, and just kind of offering my own family's perspective on this, I mentioned in the last episode that I have an 11th great-grandfather, Edward Whalley, who ends up a general in the Parliamentarian Army, ends up one of the regicides signing the death warrant of King Charles. But at this point, he's at the Battle of Edgehill. He is a low-ranking officer in the cavalry under... I think it was like his uncle, John Fiennes, who commanded one of the cavalry units. And after this battle, because of his performance here, he's going to be promoted to major. He's eventually going to end up a colonel in command of one of the regiments in the Parliament Army, and eventually rises, I think, to like major general or even lieutenant general.
With its battle array formed on the level ground just in front of Radway, Charles I's Royalists arrayed their army in 2 lines of battle, opting to deploy in the Swedish-style checkerboard formation rather than in the Dutch style, which would allow the second-line regiments to form a continuous front if needed. Infantry brigades in the first line, from left to right, were led by Henry Wentworth, Richard Fielding, and Charles Gerard.
This is such a fascinating time in history to me because it's like this amalgamation of the old and the new when it comes to weapons. You've got artillery on the battlefield, but you also have guys with pikes and swords. You have guns, and you have the old weapons all at one. It's really kind of just really crazy.
While those to the rear were led by Sir Nicholas Byron and John Bellasis. All appear to have been about the same size, for a total infantry force of just over 9,000 men. Opposite them were Essex's infantry, formed up into 3 large but loosely formed brigades of roughly 4,000 men each for a total of 12,000 foot. The central brigade took up a mainly defensive position behind a small hill, while the 2 on the flanks were slightly in front. Most of the cavalry on both sides of the battlefield was present on Prince Rupert's Royalist right wing. He held overall command on this flank, had a unit of 1,000 dragoons, and was opposed by James Ramsay's Parliamentary cavalry. Also on this side of the battlefield was a unit of Parliamentary Dragoon Mobile Infantry and musketeers hidden to ambush in a nearby hedgerow. On the other flank, slightly less numerous Royalist cavalry under Henry Wilmot faced those commanded by the Duke of Bedford. It's said that King Charles visited every unit of his cavalry and all of his infantry formations in order to review his troops and encourage them for the coming battle.
I don't think anyone's ever accused Charles I of being a coward or in any way afraid to fight. Yes, he's obviously concerned more about himself than he is about his men, but he knows what it takes to lead in this situation.
He even wished to ride with his army, but was persuaded to retire to the rear with his small lifeguard cavalry reserve, the majority of which had persuaded the king to let them join Rupert's charge. The first major battle of the English Civil War finally began at 2 p.m. with an artillery duel.
Late in the day.
Lasting for 1 hour, neither bombardment inflicted heavy losses and served more as a loud prelude to the real battle. While this was going on, dragoons on Rupert's extreme right wing were able to discover and eventually repel the Roundhead ambushers within the hedgerow, providing the main cavalry force with a free run at the enemy. With Essex's army unwilling to move first, fighting began when both of the Royalist cavalry wings launched a thunderous head-on charge at their opposition. Using the latest cavalry shock tactics of direct charge imported from the continent by Prince Rupert, the king's horsemen on both flanks swept away Parliament's cavalry,
So this is where it's nice to have a guy like Rupert who's educated, who knows the latest tactics, especially when you're dealing with two armies that don't have a lot of combat experience.
Still used stationary Dutch tactics of firing from saddleback. A unit of parliamentarian troopers even deserted and joined the Royalists.
Wow. And you're going to see a lot of that happen in these situations. A lot of these guys, I shouldn't say a lot, some of these guys are opportunists, right? They're doing this because there's an opportunity to get ahead, to advance your own station. And if you think your side's got a better chance of doing that, that's the side you're going to fight with. It's not really necessarily about principles to you or anything like that. And so now what we have is, this is why you put your cav on the flanks, because if you can defeat the enemy cavalry, now you've got a mobile ability to get at his rear, to get at his leadership, get at his artillery.
With both of Essex's mounted wings swept off the field, it seemed like the time was right for the king's horse to pivot and launch the coup de grace against Parliament's flank and rear. However, due to the indiscipline of its commanders and individual soldiers, who were flushed with the glory of victory, they instead continued chasing the routed enemy. Historians believe that if the Royalist cavalry had halted, regrouped and charged at this point,
could have been it right there.
The English Civil War could have been put to a decisive end, but it was not to be, and the
little things like that determine the outcome of nations. It's amazing to think about.
Opportunity was lost. With almost all horsemen now off the field, both infantry forces filed into a single line of battle and prepared to advance. Musketeers blasted away and softened up the opposing foot, before the pikemen, wielding their 16-foot-long weapons, came into contact and engaged in a so-called push of pike, a shoving match during which the two sides literally pushed each other until one broke. Better equipped parliamentary footmen managed to gain a slight advantage, and casualties slowly began to mount on both sides. Now that all of the Royalist cavalry had victoriously left the field, two Parliamentary Reserve cavalry units under Sir William Balfour and Philip Stapleton, which had previously been hidden behind a small hill, struck the flanks of Byron's unit. After subsequently bursting through the Royalist centre, Balfour managed to disable a few of the enemy's artillery pieces. Without knowing it, they had also come extremely close to capturing the king's sons, Charles and his brother James. In the midst of the fighting, the king's royal standard was seized by the parliamentary infantry.
Both future kings, Charles and James, they would both eventually come to the throne.
But was then recaptured by a Royalist cavalry officer. By late afternoon, inexperienced soldiers on both sides were shaken by the experience of battle, and by dusk, Rupert's cavalry returned and stabilized the situation.
Welcome back.
Neither side had any further stomach for the battle, and both backed off at nightfall. By the time morning came, the Royalists had retreated from the field, and the battle ended as a stalemate. The 1,500 dead soldiers was a small casualty count when compared.
It's really not, though. I mean, 1,500 dead in a clash between armies of around 10,000 each. I mean, I mean, when you count all the wounded, that's not insignificant.
To the horrors on the continent, primarily due to the terribly cold night which followed the battle at Edgehill, which helped to seal the fate of many injured troops. Contrary to the expectations of many present, however, Edgehill was not decisive, and the English Civil War would continue into 1643. Our series on the battle between King Charles and his rebellious parliament will continue, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it.
Awesome. So that was great. Great introduction to the war. Love the kind of the way they lay things out. Really excited to continue this conversation. Things are going to continue to be one episode ahead for our members and our patrons. So you'll get to see the next episode a day before everybody else does. When this one goes live, the next one will be available. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.